now to the subject of light exposure, which we've touched on, but if people have listened to the 2 episodes on circadian clocks and circadian rhythms that I published in the first season of this podcast, then they'll be familiar with the fact that our patterns of light exposure act as the main time cue, or Zeitgeber, for the master clock in the suprachiasmatic nucleus or nuclei in the brain that's particularly important to influencing our sleep-wake cycles. And there is a concept that can be quite difficult to describe, especially without the presence of a graph. And so listeners could actually pull up such a graph themselves, named a phase response curve, which basically plots how the direction of the master clock changes according to when somebody is exposed to certain types of light relative to the timing of their body's clock. This isn't a straightforward question, Deborah, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Could you do your best to describe how the phase response curve looks? And I'm actually keeping notes at the same time, because if you describe it in a way that is much, much better than anything I'm able to, then I'm just going to steal it from you.
Right. Okay. Well, I'd like to take one step back and explain, why. Remember, it's the biological clocks in our body and in the body of all animals. We evolved on Earth, and the best way for animals and organisms to stay synchronized to life on Earth is to be able to respond to the light-dark cycle of our 24-hour life on Earth. So if we were in Mars, we would have a different phase response curve. So it's the most natural thing that our clocks are able to respond to light. And if you need to synchronize a clock that could be longer than 24 hours, our natural clock could be longer than 24 hours, or it could be shorter than 24 hours, it means that we have to have the ability to speed up our clocks with light, or slow down our clocks with light. So light has 2 effects on our circadian system. Light is able to advance our clock, so speed it up, or light is able to delay our clock or slow it down. And its ability to advance and its ability to delay the clock depends on when you receive the light. And so the phase response curve is exactly that. It is a varying ability to respond to light according to the time of your biological system. And so the answer to your question is light in the morning after your core body temperature minimum advances the human circadian timing system, and light in the evening and up until midnight, 2-3 o'clock in the morning delays your clock or slows your clock down. So if you draw it, you will have an advanced portion in the morning and you will have a delayed portion in the evening.
Just returning to something that came up earlier, if the core body temperature minimum is roughly 2 hours before waking and somebody naturally wakes at 7 a.m., then the period from about the temperature minimum to 4 hours after that is going to accelerate the clock, speeding it up, shifting somebody earlier. That would be between about 5 a.m. and 9 a.m. for that person. Whereas if they wanted to slow down their clock, push it later because they're moving to a night shift, they would want lots of light between about 4 hours before the temperature minimum and 2 hours before the temperature minimum. This next question might seem a little esoteric. I'm going to ask it anyway because I've got you on the line and I'm curious about your thoughts on it. Some people seem to doubt whether the types of cones in the eye that detect long wavelength light, so this light might look quite red, contribute to the process of moving the clock around. And the process of synchronizing the clock with the world around us is called entrainment. Do you think that there's any good evidence suggesting that red light specifically can shift the timing of the clock? Or do you think if it's the nighttime and somebody is actively trying to avoid moving the clock around, red light could be helpful because it would let them see, but it wouldn't necessarily either advance or delay their circadian system?
Right. I mean, the color of light that you've mentioned now, red or also blue, so that's the wavelength of the light that's in the light source in your factory or whatever, is one part of the equation. But the other part that's important is the intensity of the light. So red light, if it is intense enough, can also shift the clock and delay and advance the clock just as much as blue light. It's just a question of intensity. So if you're thinking of using light to stay entrained, then, and we've just published some recommendations on this, you want high, bright, blue contained light during the day to wake you up, keep you alert, and enable you to see and to operate. And then a few hours before sleep, 3 or 4 hours before sleep, all that has to get toned down. Not only you want to move from the blue light to more of a reddish light, but also tone down the intensity. The intensity has sort of been left out of the sort of blue-red light color. You know, I mean, we were one of the first to show how effective blue light was, and it all was very sexy, and everyone was talking about red light and blue light. But it's also the intensity. So you can manipulate light for shift workers just simply by toning down the amount of light, the number of photons, the irradiance of light that is projected. So if you're thinking of designing a room where you don't want people to be affected by light, then it should be low intensity, and you want to be not have too much blue. So you could translate that into having a little bit of red. But it's not just red, because if you've got high intense red, it's going to do something as well.
The recommendations paper that you're referring to is one that I referenced previously in my series. I think Tim Browner is the first author on it. It's published in PLOS Biology.
Yes,
and
it is.
It's well worth a read.
It is.
But regarding shift workers, there have been a few studies that have tried to modify the light environment in the workplace, whether that's through changes to electric lighting and or using blue blocking glasses, which have a red hue, and to some people they look silly, a bit like something that George Michael might have been wearing in the 80s, but they can be helpful because they reduce exposure at the level of the eye to this type of short wavelength light that's best able to produce non-visual functions, including moving the clock around. Could you give some of your thoughts on why some of the studies haven't shown much, and maybe also touch on some of the research that you yourself have done? I know that you published some work with Storle Pellison. Again, I'm sure I'm butchering the name of that person, and also the Eurythia Consortium too.
Yeah. Why doesn't it work? I think probably the one of the reasons why light might not be showing, well, it depends what you want to use light for. Let's start there. We've touched on light's ability to shift the timing of the clock, speed it up or slow it down, the phase response curve. But light also has acute effects. So light at night, does things just immediately. It will increase your alertness, increase your performance, and if given at night, it will reduce your production of melatonin. So these are acute effects, nothing to do with the clock, really. And so we also have to bear that in mind. Now, it's a challenge to design lighting for shift workers. Because first of all, those shift workers, as we already talked about, they don't know where their clock is. I don't know where their clock is. I don't know where their peripheral clocks are, where their master clock is. Now, when we do experiments to try and shift people's clocks, we like to know they're all in the same place before we start using light to shift them. So it could be that the shift workers arriving on a night shift are they're in an inappropriate phase, or their timing is inappropriate to respond to the light that we're trying to give them. And so the effect is being cancelled out. Of course, again, it depends on the scenario of the shift worker. Fine if you're in a factory and you can really increase the lighting and keep everybody awake all night, because light is alerting, everybody's awake. It's like a light shower. It keeps you awake at night acutely. You can do it. But what about nurses working, on a ward? They can't keep the lights bright because the patients have to sleep. So then they're in a little nurse station. And how much light are they really getting? Because then they might have to go and see a patient. So, we can't even kind of measure how much light they get, because every nurse on every schedule, depending on the ward, the hospital. So the best way we try and do it is to track using a light sensor around somebody's neck, or if they can wear glasses with a sensor, we can begin to track the individual light exposure of that person. And then we can try and work out, okay, they got that light then, they got that intense light at that time of day, that at that time of day. And we can try and predict what that light might be doing to their clocks based on our knowledge that we've gained from very careful lab studies and the knowledge we have of the phase response curve. But otherwise, effectively, sorry to use the expression, you're in the dark. If you put a light in a nurse's office in a ward, I can't predict how they're going to respond because I don't know where their clocks are to start with.
I think in the future we'll get to a point where there are closed loop systems where there's real-time monitoring of people's circadian phases, maybe in different bodily tissues, as well as patterns of light exposure at the level of the eye. And then you could design some glasses that are modifying light environment in real time in order to shift somebody appropriately given their upcoming schedule. But we might be a few years from that just yet. Totally. I'm sure that there will be companies that are trying to commercialize it probably before there's any good science on it.
You're exactly right. It's all about modeling. It would all be about modeling. It would be, what is your input, what's your irradiance, what's your wavelength, what's your activity, all your inputs. You could model all of those, and you could make some prediction about this is a good time to sleep, this is a good time to work, and it could feed back. This is the theory, as you say. It's where the research is going, and we will get there. But I must do one word of caution. All these beautiful, elaborate lab studies that we and others have done, they're often very healthy men and sometimes women. They're not often done in people who have diseases. They're not done often in older people with different types of any condition. So, our knowledge is very much based on the healthy, normal, young. So whether the modeling and the predictions work for other clinical groups also still needs to be done.
An unfortunately large proportion of research has been done on 20-year-old men, but that is changing. So that's good news. And the subject of light exposure, of course, brings up the subject of melatonin too. And one of the reasons that I mentioned the phase response curve is because you can also plot a phase response curve for melatonin ingestion. And it's possible to use melatonin and light exposure to additively shift a person's clock. And when I think about melatonin, Debra, without blowing smoke, I can think of few people other than yourself who have such deep expertise in melatonin as you do. So I think you're exactly the right person to be asking about this. But regarding that phase response curve, is it fair to say that the curve for melatonin and the curve for light are roughly 12 hours apart?
It is absolutely fair to say that. That's the simple message for everybody. So melatonin in the morning will delay the clock, and melatonin in the evening will advance the clock. Exactly the opposite to what light does. Melatonin, at least in all the studies to date, isn't as effective as light in the amount of shifting that you get. It's about half the effectiveness of it. But I always say when I'm teaching on this, if you're taking melatonin and exposing yourself to light at the same time, you're doing the wrong thing. The two are cancelling each other out.
And I know that you've done some work looking at people who have lost their sight, and some of those people no longer have functional cells in the retina that are particularly important to relaying information about the light environment back to the master clock, and these cells are called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. So for some people, melatonin might be more able to shift the clock because they no longer respond to light the way that the rest of us do. But regarding shift workers, you published some very interesting work, again with Claudia. She's come up several times today, a couple of years ago, looking at whether melatonin supplementation can improve metabolic health in night shift workers, in part by reducing circadian misalignment. Can you tell us about that? Because I think it is actually something that could be very practical for a lot of people if they can source good melatonin.
Yeah, and this, of course, our early work was on the blind, and because they're not responsive to light, melatonin is their only option. And we showed very clearly that in these totally blind people, so no conscious perception of light, that melatonin daily can entrain their circadian system, and that's been very helpful to them. In those days, we didn't know about peripheral clocks, and we weren't so focused on how clocks regulate metabolism. And so it's only more recently that we've begun to think about melatonin's effect on metabolism. And this was a study designed by the first author, Eleni Marquez, from Sao Paulo. And they gave, I remember being heavily involved in designing this protocol. We thought about it quite carefully. But we looked at markers that people hadn't looked at before, like weight and overweight and things like this. And melatonin certainly seems to have some potential with that in the study. It was found to be useful. It was a placebo-controlled study. You mentioned the quality of the melatonin. It's an important point. Every now and again we get odd little papers out saying they've measured melatonin in every health food shop in America, and some have no melatonin in, and some have 10 times the amount. Definitely, they're more reliable sources of melatonin than others, and we've always used pharmaceutical prepared melatonin, so we're sure of the dose, and that can be helpful. And some of those preparations, if one reads the papers, you can get preparations good quality like that. But coming back, we're already almost overdosing when we take 1 milligram of melatonin. So if you only got 90% melatonin in that compound, it's still going to work because we're well above the physiological amount of melatonin. So I'm not so concerned about whether the dose of melatonin might vary if you want to take it for jet lag or shift work. But I'm more concerned about the purity. If, for example, you're a blind person and you have to take it every day for the rest of your life, then I'd want a pharmaceutical company to prepare that, because, you don't want any toxicity building up for chronic use.
Just to mention one of these studies specifically, there was an analysis done of melatonin products taken off the shelves in health shops in North America, and the concentrations of melatonin in the products varied from about 80% less than what was on the label to 480% more than what was on the label, and some of them contain serotonin. So regarding your comment about purity, this is a real issue, and I think the supplement industry now is better regulated than it once was. But ideally, you would certainly get a melatonin product that's been third-party tested to ensure that it contains what it claims it contains. And there is a website named Consumer Lab where anyone can go and sign up and find out more about purity. And if you look across different products, then I have no affiliation with this company, but the company Life Extension, their products always check out. So when recommending specific supplements, I tend to say Life Extension by default tend to contain what they actually say they do. And also, just to mention something about the specific protocol that you used in that study, Deborah, I think you used 3 milligrams of melatonin in that study, and it was taken on non-night shifts, and I think it was taken shortly before bedtime. And it showed that doing that reduced circadian misalignment in people experiencing the most circadian misalignment, and then that related some improvements in metabolic health too. So on that subject, I'd just like your thoughts on how safe melatonin is, because this is a subject that is now bandied around by people who don't have the kind of expertise in melatonin that you do. And a lot of people make noise about how it could be bad for reproductive health, for instance, or if it's taken by young people, then it could contribute to some developmental issues, particularly with respect to, say, Tanner's stages of puberty. And my impression, having looked at the literature, is that there's not actually much evidence of that. Certainly, melatonin strongly affects reproductive health and cycling in animals that are very photoperiodic. So think of ewes, for example. I know that you've done some work looking at ewes specifically. How safe do you think melatonin is? Do you think that there are real causes for concern if the melatonin that's being used is pure?
There's not as much data as we would like, but at least all the data that we have to date, it looks fairly safe and easily tolerated. So it's not addictive if we're thinking of it as a supplement to perhaps reduce your sleep latency and allow you to get to sleep more quickly, which is quite something that melatonin is used for in older people. It's not addictive like if you were taking a benzodiazepine to sleep, for example. So I think it's about comparing risks and benefits with what else you would give instead. That would be one thought about the sleep. I like to separate children from adults. So we have never given melatonin to children because we were concerned, like you say, about the possible reproductive effects pre-puberty. But of course, since melatonin is available as a sort of slow release preparation, 2 milligrams, and is available on prescription in the UK, the prescriptions for melatonin in children have just soared like this. You can look at the data. It's incredibly popular. And of course, it's given by parents to children, and these children might have some quite serious learning difficulties, behavioral types of disorders, and very fragmented and disrupted sleep. So then it becomes a clinical decision as to a way of perhaps calming down the child and allowing, because I always think of melatonin, it's not a sleep hormone. It is not involved in sleep, but it's something that begins to rise naturally before you sleep. So it's the sort of telling your body, prepare yourself for sleep. So I know that melatonin is given to children, for example, before they go into a CT scan, just to calm them down for all the noise. There's a sort of calming thing that children get from, and so I'm on the fence about giving melatonin to children. I think parents sometimes need it to have some sort of normal lives for their other children and themselves. If you have a child who's severely neuro disabled, it's a clinical decision. I mean, whether it affects the time of your puberty might not be such a driving decision here, right? So I would leave it always up to the clinician and they can prescribe according to what they've heard from the parents and the children about melatonin and kids. The safety, there's just not enough data. As you say, it's available in health food shops. We've got millions of Americans taking melatonin every night just to reduce sleep latency. But, we hardly get any side effects reported. So, I know that's not evidence, but it's a kind of counter argument that it is quite safe. And if you've got good purity, and especially if you're going long term like we do in our blind people, we've had our blind people back after years of taking melatonin, done by some biochemical analysis on them, and nothing really's changed. So we're not picking up anything big, but that's as far as we are. I still think we still need a lot more work on that.
I think your comments about there always being trade-offs and considering what the alternatives are really important, because if the alternatives are habit-forming medications that lead to significant tolerance and withdrawal effects, and based on what you're saying about the biochemistry and so on, melatonin doesn't seem to lead to any stark changes over time. And if anything, kids might be slightly better behaved and maybe have slightly more consolidated sleep, then the net effect might be positive, even if there were some very small effect on the timing of puberty. So we need to consider the whole picture, but I want to use melatonin as a non-seamless segue to sleep. And you spoke about how melatonin isn't a sleep hormone. It's really an internal signal of darkness. It's like an internal time cue or endogenous zeitgeber. And that brings up the subject of sleep. At the start, you mentioned that many shift workers experience sleep issues, and there's actually a disorder named shift work disorder that seems to affect roughly a quarter of shift workers. And in these people, in part because they can't align their circadian systems with their shifts, they experience substantial fatigue, sleepiness, mood issues while they have to be awake. And then when they do eventually try and sleep, often because their body's clocks are promoting wakefulness, they have insomnia symptoms. So I was just curious about what your recommendations would be for shift workers who are struggling with their sleep, probably particularly with respect to the regularity of their sleep.
Okay, so we're assuming when we're talking about shift workers, they're doing overnight shifts in some rotation, or they're night shift workers. Because, somebody, when we started, we said if you work outside 9 to 5, because, for example, a lot of younger people now might work till 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, and then sleep. So, that's a shift worker, but not the overnight. It's the overnight that's the real thing. So, a definition of a severe shift work for me would be someone who works sometime between midnight and 5 in the morning, because that's when we should be sleeping. So coming back to recommendations. So if they're then having to sleep in the day, like you say, you're having to sleep, if you're not adapted, so that's your first night of night shift, the next morning you are sleeping when your body is saying, wake up, you're alert, get going. Your cortisol is waking you up, it's setting you up, you've got the alerting response of the two process model, and you can't sleep. So the cheap versions are, of course, a dark room, a quiet room, so earplugs, eye mask, blackout curtains if you can afford it. The others would be, of course, some shift workers do take something to try and put them to sleep. So we did try very early on one of Josephine Arendt's early studies, where shift working police officers took melatonin in the morning when they were trying to sleep. And that seemed to work. It's a very small study. So you could include that with the black curtains and the quiet sleep as well. So that's to try and improve daytime sleep. The other would be to try and avoid any alerting things before you try and sleep. So I would try not to have very bright light before you go to bed in the morning, because that bright light is alerting. That bright light also shifts the clock, like we've already discussed. So if you feel safe and you could wear sunglasses. We've had studies showing that sunglasses in the morning before you go to bed are effective. But be aware that if you are tired and you're putting on sunglasses and you're driving home, you might really fall asleep at the wheel. So when I say reduce your light input, that is assuring that you feel safe in that position. And then, of course, avoid like a big caffeine hit in the early morning hours before you sleep. So it's like the sleep hygiene backwards to prepare yourself for a day's sleep.
One more thing to mention is that because they're often trying to sleep during the day when the sun is up, the temperature is higher too. So it's not only that the world is noisier because most people are awake and the sun is up, so their bedrooms are going to be brighter, but also if the temperature is higher, then trying to keep the bedroom cool might be relatively more important. So that could be using a fan. It could be having a high sleep capacity mattress, so choosing a hybrid mattress or a spring mattress instead of a foam mattress. But the other subject that's relevant here is napping. Obviously, very long naps can be problematic when used at inappropriate times because they will pay off a lot of the pressure to sleep that's accumulated with prior wakefulness. You can think of this pressure to sleep as being a bit like your hunger for sleep, and that in general, the longer that you've been without sleep, the hungrier for sleep you are, but also there are peaks and troughs in that hunger too. And the issue with long naps, and specifically naps that contain a substantial amount of the deeper stage of sleep, is they sate that hunger. And so regarding naps, Deborah, if people are using naps opportunistically, do you have any recommendations for how to best use them? And I suppose arguably the most important type of nap that somebody might take is a so-called safety nap, where they're about to do something that could be dangerous, such as driving home when sleepy. How should somebody best use napping on those occasions?
Right. So I'll refer here to quite a bit of Professor Jim Horn's work, where he was looking at sleepiness and driving, and he did very controlled experiments about the length of the nap, and then also combining that with caffeine. So this is about using naps and caffeine to stay awake. So when do we want to stay awake? In a shift work scenario, we want to stay awake during the shift, right? So we don't injure ourselves or other people as we started this whole conversation. So I think quite a few shift workers do this, that they do tend to nap before they go onto their night shift, if they can, again, depending on their family circumstances. So napping in the late afternoon, evening, before they then go. So you could have a nap and then also have some caffeine at that point, because the caffeine will kick in during the night shift, middle of the night shift type of thing. And then when you get to work, you could still have quite a bit of light at that point, because your light will delay your clock just a little, but it would also keep you alert. The main thing with the napping and the light and the caffeine is to start toning all of that down about 4 hours before you want to go to bed. So, from about 4 o'clock in the morning, you shouldn't be doing that, because that will keep you awake when you want to have your day sleep. So it's about just having it either before you start your shift or during your shift. When you start, have a cup of coffee, have some bright light, and that could sustain you across.
Well said. And looking at Jim Horn's work, I know that he has done a lot to help identify the best types of caffeine naps. Some people call these nappuccinos, where you might, for instance, have a substantial amount of caffeine immediately before a nap of 10 to 20 minutes. And the doses used in those studies are quite high. Some of them have used doses of roughly 200 milligrams of caffeine, which is about 3 espresso shots, but you don't need to take a dose that's that high necessarily. One more comment on caffeine is that if you look at some of the studies of extended wakefulness, and people such as David Dinges have done some of these, then regularly taking low doses of caffeine seems to be a helpful strategy for a lot of people, because they're better able to maintain some important cognitive functions, in particular vigilance. When they do nap, they seem to have less sleep inertia following those naps, and sleep inertia is the process that makes you feel groggy after the nap. And so you can be back in the room faster if you have these regular low doses of caffeine. And then obviously the total amount of caffeine that you consume while you're awake might be lower. So it could be better to go for regular doses of, say, up to 50 milligrams of caffeine consumed every couple of hours, than consuming a heroic dose of caffeine at the very start of the shift schedule. I know that there's some, albeit limited, work suggesting that caffeine might independently be able to slightly shift the timing of somebody's body's clock. And maybe the best demonstration of this that I'm aware of is a study that was published by Tina Burke and Ken Wright a few years ago. And they gave participants 2.9 milligrams of caffeine per kilo. So if you were 80 kilos, that's roughly 240 milligrams of caffeine. So it's a large dose. That's like 2 store-bought Americanos, 3 hours before their bedtimes. And they found that shifted people's melatonin rhythms by about 40 minutes later. And then they did some mechanistic work to try and understand what some of the biological bases of that might be. Are you aware of anyone having tried to plot a phase response curve for caffeine, Deborah? I'm just thinking, if somebody takes caffeine shortly after waking in the morning and they're taking it at an early circadian phase, not long after their core body temperature minimum, then I wouldn't expect that to delay their clock. And I'm not aware of any evidence that shows that, but I haven't seen somebody try to systematically plot a phase response curve for caffeine using appropriate methods.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, when Ken Wright's paper that you're talking about came out, I mean, my first thought was, oh, it's a pity they only gave one dose at a single time point. And of course, so the obvious question is, at different times of the day, what effect that would have. So we are, I think, in need of a phase response curve to caffeine, because if it really is affecting the clock, then it should have a phase response curve, because that is the definition. If you need to synchronize a clock, you need to be able to delay the clock and advance the clock, else synchronization doesn't work. Okay, so they've shown one way that it delays, and so if it's really affecting, and I think they tried to say it was affecting the SCN clock, right, then it should also advance. That's the story. If it doesn't advance, then it's not really a time cue Zeitgeber. There's something else going on. And we can say the same about exercise now, or about food. People have given food at a set time and measured what it does to the clock. People have given exercise at a set time, what it does to the clock. But to really prove it's working as a bona fide time giver or Zeitgeber, it needs to do both. That's the definition. And of course, light can do both, and melatonin can do both.
And it might be that there are some other dietary constituents that could help shift workers that aren't so widely discussed, but they are getting more attention now. Deborah, I remember having a conversation with you years ago about creatine monohydrate. It's something that I've been excited about probably since I was about 16 and took it for the first time, but that was because I was interested in getting stronger and looking better for girls. But since then, we now know that creatine is good for the brain in many ways. And when you look at homeostatic sleep drive, which is that hunger for sleep that accumulates with increasing time awake, then the main correlate of that seems to be the concentration of adenosine between cells in the brain. And by taking creatine monohydrate, you can increase creatine stores in the brain. And going by some studies of non-human animals, rats specifically, adding creatine monohydrate to the chow of rats seems to reduce the accumulation of adenosine in the brain. And then in accordance with that, the rats sleep less, their sleep is less deep, and they have less rebound sleep after sleep deprivation. So whereas one rat who hadn't had creatine in their chow would sleep a lot longer following sleep deprivation, the rat that has creatine monohydrate in the chow doesn't have that same substantial increase in their sleep when they are eventually allowed to sleep, which is really interesting. And this hasn't been well studied in humans yet, but there's some evidence suggesting that creatine can help offset some of the negative effects of insufficient sleep, in particular on some proxies of cognitive function and on some quite simple motor skills too. So I think creatine monohydrate is definitely something that could be really relevant to a lot of shift workers, and it's something that we know to be very safe and to generally be good for the health of people. So I actually feel quite comfortable saying that taking a 5-gram dose of creatine monohydrate per day with a meal is probably not a bad option for shift workers. And then the other substance that I think is quite interesting is L-tyrosine, which is an amino acid precursor of the neuromodulators noradrenaline and dopamine. And during extended wakefulness, the brain is, of course, under a substantial amount of stress, and noradrenaline and dopamine get turned over faster than were sleep permitted. And to support that increased turnover, you can supplement L-tyrosine, and by providing additional precursor, you can probably help maintain levels of noradrenaline and dopamine in the brain in levels that are closer to optimal. And while the research on this subject is very much in its infancy, that again seems to help maintain some cognitive functions during sleep deprivation or sleep restriction. Once again, it's relatively safe. It's something that most of us consume by way of our diets anyway. You probably only need 1 or 2 grams of it a day. I mentioned those in part to transition us now to nutrition, Deborah, because you spoke then about nutrition and physical activity as time cues for the circadian system, and probably different clocks in the circadian system. You published what, in my opinion, is probably the best study to date looking at whether diet timing is a time cue for some clocks in the circadian system. This was a paper that came out in 2017 in Current Biology. Can you tell us about this? It's a wonderful study that people should read if they're interested.
Thank you. Yes. In collaboration, of course, Jonathan Johnston was the PI on that study, and Sophie Verens is the first name. She was our postdoc. The design was clever because we ensured that we didn't change the light-dark cycle. And all we did to our volunteers, we had them in the lab in controlled conditions. They had breakfast, lunch, and supper at a certain schedule. And then after 3 or 4 days of that schedule, we shifted the whole breakfast, lunch, and supper regime by 5 hours. So we delayed the whole meal pattern by 5 hours. And we measured both the SCN-driven melatonin and cortisol rhythms, so the central clock function, as well as we measured glucose and triglycerides in the periphery. And with the idea and the hypothesis that the food would only shift the peripheral clocks and not affect the melatonin cortisol driven rhythms. And that's exactly what we found. And why we had that hypothesis was because that had been shown in animal work before. But our study was the first to actually show it in humans, that food timing, if you shift the timing of food, you can shift the timing of some peripheral clock outputs.
And this brings up the subject of time-restricted eating, which we can define as only consuming calorie-containing items in a period of 12 hours or less each day. So, for example, if up until 10 a.m. you only drink black coffee without any sugar added to it, and then from 10 a.m. until 7 p.m. you eat, and then after 7 p.m. you only have non-caloric drinks or more or less non-caloric drinks like herbal teas without anything added to them, then that would be a 9-hour eating window. There's a lot of research now showing various benefits of time-restricted eating in non-shift workers, but the last few years have included studies of shift workers, and Sachin Panda published some lovely work on firefighters in California showing that using a 10-hour time-restricted eating window is feasible in these people and seems to yield some health benefits. And maybe the study that I personally found most interesting is another study by Frank Shear's group, where they looked at whether daytime restricted eating would reduce internal misalignment, and they used a marker of the master clock to look at that relative to when food was coming in. And in conjunction with that, they found that people's blood sugar control improved and their mood was better than when they ate during the nighttime. So the implication here is that for people who are periodically working night shifts whose clocks aren't fully adjusted to those night shifts, they might want to try and maintain a relatively regular eating window each day, and possibly have a window that is fixed as much as possible, overlapping between the days that they are working nights and the days they're not working nights, but if anything, have it more skewed towards the days that they're not working nights, bearing in mind that their clocks aren't going to fully adjust to their night shifts. So with that long preamble, Debra, do you have any thoughts on how to best practice time-restricted eating in a shift working context?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like some more studies to be done, but I think it's all going in a predictable direction. It's in its early days, time-restricted feeding, but it's looking promising. And the logical next step would be to say, for shift workers, to try not to eat, between midnight and 5 o'clock, really only eat, if you can, in daytime hours. So it's effectively saying what you're saying, because we think one of the major reasons for all these metabolic problems in shift work is that you're eating at the wrong time. And that is a stress, a metabolic stress on your body, and therefore you become overweight and type 2 diabetes, etc. So so if we can keep the timing of meals in line with the master clock that doesn't shift, and not shift the timing of the meals either, that might work. But as I say, we need a lot more studies. And to answer some very basic questions like that, I'd like to start by doing these types of studies in simulated shift work, even just with healthy men and women, young, because there's some fundamental questions that we still haven't worked out about that. First of all, exactly when not to eat overnight. Try and get what I'd call a healthy eating window during night shift work and see what happens there. And then I know the next thing you're going to ask me, well, what type of food? Should it be, high protein, reduced carbohydrate, low fat? I mean, we think it should be low fat. Some of the very early work Josephine Arendt did at Surrey, she showed clearly that if we eat the same meal at midnight compared to that same meal at 12 o'clock noon, you know, the levels of fat in your blood, the triglycerides in your blood, just don't come down the way they come down when you eating that meal in the day. And high levels of triglycerides in your body at midnight are a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So, you know, we want to, I would say, if people could go on shift and eat very light, non-fat meals, if they have to eat at all, would be a good way forward. But I think we need more experiments to actually show it before we start, you know, kind of making policy decisions on what shift workers should eat.
And I know that you've done some work looking at what and when shift workers eat too. In particular with Alan Flanagan, you published a couple of papers in recent years showing that as night shifts go by, people might distribute more and more of their food intake to the nighttime. And also among people who work shifts, their own eating patterns might influence those of some members of their family. So it's just another reminder that these people influence the rest of us too, sometimes relatively directly and sometimes more indirectly. But regarding diet composition in general, intriguingly, there don't seem to be large differences between shift workers and non-shift workers in terms of the total amount of food that they eat. If anything, there's some evidence suggesting that the quality of their diets might be slightly lower. Maybe they consume fewer fruits and vegetables, slightly more sugary drinks. Maybe they snack slightly more frequently, which is no great surprise based on the fact that they've got to be up all night long some of the time. But I agree with you that when they do snack, they should probably keep those snacks relatively small. And maybe there should be some protein in there, not that much carbohydrate, not that much fat, and maybe a little bit of fiber. And then otherwise, just try and stick to as regular an eating window as possible. And then finally, just moving to physical activity. My own take on this is that the exercise guidelines that are made for the rest of the population largely apply to shift workers. Right now, I think the government physical activity guidelines don't mention anything regarding exercise timing, but there is some evidence suggesting that when people exercise might influence the timing of some of their clocks. And that's no great surprise for tissues such as skeletal muscle, because the fact that exercise timing can influence muscle clocks is basically relaying that information to the muscles so that the muscles can anticipate when people are being active and therefore optimize local functions so that people are ready for that activity when it is coming up. But do you see timed exercise as a helpful way to shift the clocks of night shift workers? And I know that you've done some work on, not this subject directly, but the influence of timed exercise on general health as part of your work with Eurith Diet. So maybe you could touch on that in here too.
Yeah, I mean, I think the step back here is that do we want to shift workers or not? You know, that is the first sort of 101 on shift work. And to answer that, you have to know what shift schedule the people are doing in the shift workers. So you go to a factory and you want to know what shifts they're doing. So if you're only doing one night of night shift or 2 nights of night shift, you don't want to shift their clocks, because if you could shift them quickly, then they're going to have to shift back when they do day work. So all you're trying to do on a 1 night and a 2 night shift is to try and maintain their lives without too much disruption. This is why we talked about the food thing, and this is why we designed that melatonin study with Eleni Marquez. We gave the melatonin in the non-shift nights to try and reinforce that message of this is normality, you know, and strengthen that message. But let's say we're talking about oil rig workers and we know they're on a 3-week of night shift. Now, in that situation, it might be beneficial to shift them more quickly to that 3 weeks so they don't have 6 or 7 days of, you know, jet lag, so to speak. We can, if we need to sharpen that up, yes, we could use light. Yes, we could use melatonin. yes, for peripheral clocks, we could use food. And yes, there have been two now. Sean Youngstead's group in San Diego published phase response curves to exercise. So it seems that exercise can advance or can delay the clock, therefore fulfilling the criteria of being a true Zeitgeber. So I think, when we know more about that, there's some it was a great study. It's nearly 100 people he studied, young people, old people. I take my hat off to him and his team. So when I say, it's just that his phase marker was urine. It's hard to know where the peak of melatonin is in urine. There are just some little things that aren't perfectly clear yet. But if we do more work and people do more studies on this, I think exercise can be brought in along with food, along with caffeine, along with light, along with melatonin as possible ways of shifting the clock when you want to shift them. But that's not for every shift worker.
And if we assume that the data in his study hold up, like you said, he was looking at 6-sulfatoxymelatonin, which is the main metabolite of melatonin in the urine, as opposed to looking at levels of melatonin in the blood, which would be preferable, then the phase response curve that he plotted for activity is quite similar to that for light. So activity in the morning tends to shift people earlier, and activity late at night tends to shift people later. But you mentioned whether we want to shift people, and we've also touched on the idea of personalising people's shift schedules in our conversation so far. I think there are things that we can probably say about what tend to work well for most people with respect to their shifts. For example, in general, forward rotating schedules, so moving from mornings to evenings to nights, seem to be less strenuous than backward rotating ones that go in an anti-clockwise direction. In general, the longer people's shifts are, the more rest they need afterwards. There are lots of stipulations that are now in place as a result of the European Working Time Directive that certainly apply to shift workers. But the last few years has seen the rise of studies looking at the personalisation of people's shift schedules. In particular, removing the shifts that seem to be most taxing for a given chronotype. For an early bird, that would be the night shift. If somebody is naturally inclined to wake at 5 in the morning and they're being asked to work from midnight until 7 a.m, then that's going to be absolutely brutal for that person. Whereas for night owls, it might be relatively straightforward. What do you make of some of this work that's been done on personalising people's shift schedules so far, and do you see it as being important to the health of these people in the future, particularly as we better understand how to measure people's biological clocks in free living?
Yeah, I mean, this is the way we're all going, individualizing medicine, personalized medicine, so therefore personalized strategies. Remember that it's almost a three-pronged approach you need, because one needs to change the institution, whether it's a factory or a hospital. So their scheduling, their shift scheduling could be optimized or better planned, like you said, maybe clockwise direction rather than anti-clockwise, not such long shifts. So there, if we are wanting to improve the health of shift workers, we've got about a three-pronged attack. We've got a pronged attack at the institutions that employ and run shift work rotas, and then we've got at the individual level, what advice we can give that each person can take for themselves to do at home and in their lives. Like we've said about perhaps napping before you go on a night shift, making sure you have a quiet bedroom, so that's at an individual level, not at the institutional level. And then, when we've done all of that, then it is about that not every rule fits everybody. So, that would be the basic information. Then we're going, oh, well, maybe for this person with this chronotype, or at this age, or that one doesn't need to do that part. You shouldn't. So then it would be like individualizing based on what the institution has set up and what guidelines we want to give to shift workers. Then we can. So I would say it comes third in the line, because we can't really do the personalized until we've got the basic elements optimized as much as we can.
That makes a lot of sense, and I'm now conscious of the clock on the wall, not the biological clock, and realise that we need to move on shortly because you have another commitment. But just to end, I want to first say a huge thank you to you. You're a superstar. And I also wanted to highlight your friend and colleague, Josephine Arendt, and the field of chronobiology recently lost her, the legend that she was. I think she was your postdoc supervisor, wasn't she? And I'm really sorry for your loss and imagine that it was heartbreaking. But I wondered if you could touch on what made her so special.
Well, I mean, throughout this whole interview, most of the studies that we've discussed, all started and were founded in her intelligence. I mean, she really was a pioneer. I mean, probably the word is overused today, but in every sense, she was a step, ahead of the game, and was the first to ever try melatonin for jet lag, melatonin in totally blind people, melatonin in shift work. These are, all first studies. This is giving melatonin as a drug. And then her shift work that she did in the oil rigs, that was all she started, all of that. And as you said, it was rather like a lab at sea because it's so controlled. So you could answer basic questions because there was no family, no children, no, they all were men, no alcohol, very quiet bedrooms, all eating the same food. So, it's a perfect place to study some basic questions. So, I was just so lucky. I was her first postdoc. I joined her in 1984, and literally I've just taken semi-retirement at the end of August, and 4 days into my retirement, I lose my mentor. So it's been something, because she's been with me, through my whole career, which was amazing. But she just was, extremely intelligent, but also kind and a listener. And of course, there were so few women in science when I joined. I think there were 2 or 3 or 4, and it was just very male dominated. So of course, as a woman in science as well, she was a hero. So yeah. But of course, what we're pleased about is right up until the end, her brain was firing. So we never saw any mental decline. And, that's a privilege, because she'll always be smart.
And I'm sure that many of your students will reflect on you in similar ways, Debra. So thank you for your work and for all of your time today.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much, Greg.